And with no money, and with not enough gall to borrow from Polly's father, John set out on what he called his long, lonely walk back to Liverpool. He couldn't afford a coach. He walked every one of the 250 miles of the journey. He signed on as first mate on a slave ship, the Brownlow, and he backslid to the point of becoming almost as bad as before. A near-fatal fever brought him to his senses, and in his delirium and just out of it, he gave his life wholly to Christ. On the 1st of February, back home, 1750, John married Mary at St. Margaret's Parish Church in Rochester, Kent. He had been offered a ship of his own. Now he had something to offer her, and of course, in 18th century style, her father as well. 6 months later, in command of his own ship, the Duke of Argyll, 100 tons and a crew of almost 30, including the captain and mate, he set out on his first journey as a slave ship captain. And for this genteel occupation, he sought the prayers of Christian people before he left. Now, his voyages were always fraught with danger. In the first place, the captain always had, by definition, an unruly crew. Sometimes he recorded in his log that he had to pin some of them to the deck in irons in order to bring them to heel. And then there was always the problem of the slaves looking for an opportunity to escape with 100, 150 or more below decks packed in like books on a shelf. If they did manage to break free, and there are many records where they did on ships, they would massacre understandingly the entire crew before they themselves tried to bring the ship back home. And then with an unruly crew and the slaves always looking for an opportunity for escape, there was disease and fever. Newton later worked out that something like 1 out of 5 sailors never returned home, which compared roughly to the figure of 1 of all 4 slaves who died in transit. And when you did land on the African coast or the West Indies, intrigue and treachery by black and white traders alike was rife. Newton said there was only one person on the African coast he ever trusted. Privateers and pirates ruled the seas. Many of the ships to and froing in an earlier century between the new lands of America and the home country disappeared without trace because the Barbary pirates from North Africa that were also patrolling the seas made sure that the economy of the North African coast depended upon white slaves, a fact that is not often brought to notice. And when you had dealt with the unruly crew and kept the slaves in check and somehow surmounted the disease and fever and the intrigue and treachery and the pirates and privateers, you had to deal with the terrible storms or tornadoes in a small ship of just 100 tons, tossed like a cork on the oceans. And he writes quite graphically of what happened then. And then the problem also was that captains were without an accurate compass or timepiece, and Greenwich had not yet been fixed as a standard point of zero longitude. So when 2 captains passed each other on the ocean, the first thing they wanted to know is, where do you think we are? It was an amazing fact that they always managed to steer their ships to a pinpoint on the African coast, which says tremendously for their ability of navigation. And then when you've dealt with the unruly crew, the slaves, the disease and fever, the intrigue and treachery, the pirateers and privates, or whatever that should be, and the storms and tornadoes, and not knowing exactly where you were, you had another crew on board, the rats, which Newton on more than one occasion records gnawed at the cordage and the sails faster than they could mend them, and even incidentally nibbled at the toes of the slaves and the sailors as they slept. He made 3 journeys in this command position, but he was increasingly uncomfortable with his way of life, which he said felt more like a turnkey or jailer, and it was. And of course, he hated his separation from Mary, but he had no other career. He was a sailor. He knew nothing else. In November 1754, he was waiting for the 4th command in charge of a brand new ship that was being built for him. He was, in fact, a most successful slave trader, and on his 3rd and what proved to be his last voyage, he lost not one member of the crew and not one slave in his journeying, which is unique in the annals of the slave traders. But while he was waiting for this in Liverpool, he suddenly experienced a seizure, which passed him out for just a few minutes. He recovered. He never experienced it again, but it ended his sailing career. So from August 1755, he was a customs officer at Liverpool. He was actually known as a tide surveyor. His job was to be rowed out by a party of men that he had under his command to every incoming ship and search them for contraband, which of course he was very able to do, being an experienced sea captain himself. He knew where you would hide something on board. There were no evangelical Anglican churches in the city of Liverpool at this time, so he worshipped with the Independents and at times with the Baptists. He visited William Grimshaw of Haworth whenever he could, riding across the Yorkshire moors, because he was so impressed at Grimshaw, and he longed for Christian evangelical fellowship. He invited George Whitefield, the great evangelist, to come and preach in the city. Mary was still down in Chatham at this time, hadn't removed up to Liverpool, and so he was living in digs, and he encouraged his landlady to invite Whitefield to come and preach for him, and the way he did it by was saying he'd pay for the Sunday lunch, and so these two men had a lunch together. Whitefield never returned to the city. Liverpool was a very hard city. Hard and godless. But it was while he was here that he began writing sermons and felt called to the ministry and was invited to preach in one or two churches. He nearly entered the independent ministry, and there were times when he seriously considered becoming an evangelist for John Wesley, and John Wesley would like him to have considered becoming his second in command to take over leadership when he himself died. But as it happened, and if I may cut the story shorter, on the 17th of June 1764 he was ordained into the Church of England and settled at Olney in Buckinghamshire as curate in charge of St. Peter's and St. Paul's. And for 16 years he was a patient, hard-working, caring country parson, often, we are told, wearing his old sea captain's jacket as he visited his people. Not very clerical, but that was Newton. He cared for his parishioners. There were only two occupations, basically, in Olney at that time. For the women and girls, it was lace making. Olney lace was world famous. And for the men and the boys, agriculture. There was little else. He commenced a children's meeting long before Robert Raikes and his Sunday schools, and he gathered what he called his little crew together. They included children from the Independent and the Baptist chapels, and if you remember and want to know, I'll tell you what problems that set up for him. But it was a regular thing. Every Thursday he gathered the children together and he preached to his little crew, as he called them. He had very good relationships with the Baptists and the Independents. Whenever the Baptists had their fraternal in the village of Olney, he would invite them to breakfast with him. And in fact, on one occasion in his diary, he comments on how he had cancelled his youth meeting so that they could all go to the Baptist chapel to hear John Sutcliffe preach. That was always very much to the worry of Mary, his wife, who was she was undoubtedly born again, but she was a very strong churchwoman, and she was a little afraid of all this fraternizing with the Baptists. And of course, he befriended William Cowper, the national poet. A little more of that in a moment. He started a Tuesday morning prayer meeting when that sort of thing was just not done. A prayer meeting when anybody was allowed to pray was not really done, particularly and especially within the Anglican Communion at that time. I often wondered what sort of numbers they had in these prayer meetings, until I read in his diary on one occasion that he commented that numbers were much thinner, partly due to the inclement weather, but also partly because there was a little bit of a downturn towards the end of the 70s, the 1770s, in the enthusiasm of the people. And he says numbers were much fewer, only about 40 in the prayer meeting. Bearing in mind the prayer meeting was at 5 o'clock in the morning before people went off to work. And then, of course, he was busy with a massive correspondence. He was best known for his correspondence in the 18th century, and he had a huge correspondence. He wasn't apparently a great orator. Richard Cecil, his first biographer, said, I quote, "His utterance was far from clear and his attitudes ungraceful. But he was a warm preacher, and he had a consistent life to back it up. He once wrote, "I measure ministers by square measure. I have no idea of the size of the table if you only tell me how long it is, but if you tell me how wide it is, I can tell you all its dimensions. So when you tell me what a man is in the pulpit, I want to know what he is like out of the pulpit before I shall know his size." His aim, he once said, was not to acquire the character of a ready speaker, but to win souls to Christ. He claimed he only preached longer than an hour when he had very little to say. But he was no mean scholar. His mother taught him to read by the age of 4, and he was learning Latin at 6. And then remember, his mother died before he reached his 7th birthday. Beyond that, he was largely self-taught, just 2 years of an inferior education in a school in Essex. But in his study, he could read his Old Testament in the original Hebrew, as he put it, with tolerable ease, and the New Testament in Greek fluently. He could read French and Latin authors without difficulty and corresponded with Dutch theologians in Latin. In 1779, he was reading his French Bible daily, and he set himself to read Essays de Morale by Pierre Nicole, all 25 volumes of it. Mind you, when he ordered it, he didn't know it was going to be 25 volumes until it arrived, but he set himself to read it. And in spite of his self-deprecating claim that about the only thing he could recall from most books on theology was that he had read them, he actually was familiar with the best writings of his day, including the critics of the Bible. And remember, his formal education was no more than 2 years in an inferior school before the age of 11. For the rest, not in the cloisters of a fine university, but in the cramped and rolling captain's cabin with 100 or more black slaves in the hold, an unruly crew to master, and with painful disease and violent death in daily attendance. And then he had just 9 years or so as tide surveyor in Liverpool, where he had a little hut, a little lamp, a crew when he called on them, and a lot of time to spare when he was teaching himself Hebrew, Greek, and perfecting his Latin and his French and whatever else he needed. Mary and John never had children of their own, but they loved children as deeply as they were in love with each other. John feared that he made an idol of Mary. Mary's health was always frail. She never seemed to fully recover from the shock she had when her husband had a seizure in Liverpool. But she was very supportive and very hospitable, and they adopted 2 nieces into the family. He cared for the servants and always wrote to them when he was away. Typical of the pastor's care for his flock in Olney was a letter written to William Cooper while he was away in London. He said, "I hope Molly Coles is recovering apace and that the quarantine between the 2 houses will soon be taken off. Please to give her my love, as to likewise Molly Mole, who I hope will be a very good girl." I'm not sure what she was up to. "And to all the Marys, Mollys, Sallys, Sarahs, etc. that come in your way, particularly Sally Johnson and Judith." Sally Johnson was one of the housemaids. His love for his household servants continued when he was in London many years later, if we can run forward just for a moment, as it had at Olney. The servants grew old with their master, and by the 1790s, John recognized that one young servant could have done the work of 3. He wrote, "Phoebe is drooping and I think will not hold out long. Crab is very asthmatic, Sally but so-so." Actually, Phoebe drooped quicker than Newton expected because she died the following day after 16 years of service. She was illiterate and ignorant when she came into the home, but she found a very warm place in Newton's heart and home. Her place was taken by Mary Walker, who had first come into the Newton household as a young orphan of 10 years. Newtons had always thought of their servants as part of the family, and when Mary Walker took up the duties of Phoebe, he noted, "I pray thee to bless her and all our little family. May we live together here as hoping to live together forever." The first year at Olney saw the publication, 1764, of his story, An Authentic Narrative. It was remarkably successful, translated into many languages as well. It was the story of his life up to that point, that year, 1764. Students, Politicians, even an admiral, made the day's journey from London to Olney to see this man once beaten on deck for deserting his ship.